June 20th, 1944, Normandy, France. The morning mist lingered over the rolling countryside as Private First Class Thomas Aldridge carefully removed his helmet, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirt-stained handkerchief. His regiment had pushed inland 14 days after the initial landings, and the weight of what they had witnessed pressed upon their shoulders more heavily than any equipment. Thomas believed the letter tucked beneath the liner of his helmet would bring him home safely to propose to Eleanor, his childhood sweetheart. What he could not possibly know was that this very letter would one day unravel a family mystery and reveal a truth that had been buried for over 7 decades. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a single wartime correspondence, discovered by a curious granddaughter, would reveal that the family history she had always known was built upon a foundation of necessary lies, and how the truth would ultimately bring healing to wounds that had festered across generations. The attic of the Aldridge family home in Millfield, Connecticut, had remained largely untouched for years. Dust particles danced in the slanting afternoon light as Catherine Aldridge climbed the narrow stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the silent house. At 32 years old, Catherine had volunteered to sort through her recently deceased grandfather's belongings, a task her father seemed eager to avoid. "Take your time up there, Kathy," her father, Robert, had said that morning before leaving for work. His voice had carried an unusual strain. Some things might be better left packed away. Catherine had dismissed his comment as the natural reluctance of a son grieving his father. Thomas Aldridge had lived to the impressive age of 96, passing peacefully in his sleep just 3 weeks earlier. The funeral had been a somber affair, with Thomas's remaining war buddies, now just 2 elderly men in wheelchairs, saluting their friend one final time. The attic was surprisingly organized for a space that had seen so little use. Cardboard boxes labeled in her grandfather's precise handwriting lined the walls. Christmas decorations, family photos, 1960s, Eleanor's clothes. Catherine moved methodically through the space, cataloging items for her father to review later. She knew her grandmother Eleanor only through photographs and family stories, as she had passed away before Catherine was born. In the far corner, beneath the sloped ceiling, sat a military trunk with T. Aldridge, 37528963, stenciled in white paint across its surface. Catherine felt a flutter of excitement as she knelt before it. Her grandfather rarely spoke about the war, and she had always been curious about his experiences. The trunk's hinges protested as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay a neatly folded uniform, yellowed with age but meticulously preserved. She lifted it carefully, breathing in the musty scent of wool and mothballs. Beneath the uniform was a small collection of medals in their original boxes, including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. Catherine had never known her grandfather had been awarded these honors. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a faded olive-drab cloth, was a standard-issue M1 helmet. She lifted it reverently, turning it over in her hands. The olive-green paint was chipped in places, revealing the steel beneath. The leather chin strap was cracked with age, but still intact. "What stories you could tell," Catherine whispered to the helmet, running her fingers along its curved surface. As she inspected the helmet, she noticed something unusual. The leather liner seemed to be fitted improperly, with one section bulging slightly. Curious, she gently pulled at the liner, and it came away from the steel shell more easily than expected. Between the liner and the helmet itself was a yellowed envelope, carefully folded and tucked away. With trembling fingers, Catherine extracted the envelope. It was addressed to Thomas Aldridge in an elegant, feminine script. The return address indicated it had come from someone named Sophia Maza in Krakow, Poland. The postmark date was smudged and illegible. Catherine hesitated. This seemed intensely personal, exactly the sort of thing her father might have meant when he suggested some things were better left packed away. But her curiosity overwhelmed her hesitation. She carefully opened the envelope, which had been unsealed for decades, and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin and delicate, the blue ink faded but still legible. Catherine began to read. "My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, then God has answered my prayers and you have survived this terrible conflict. I write this with no certainty that you will ever receive these words, but I must put them to paper nonetheless. The days we shared in Krakow during those chaotic weeks will forever remain in my heart as a light in the darkest of times. When your unit liberated our neighborhood and you were assigned to oversee food distribution, I never imagined that the American soldier with kind eyes would change my life forever. Our daughter is beautiful, Thomas. She has your eyes and your determined spirit. I have named her Helena after my grandmother. She is now 2 months old and growing stronger each day, despite the hardships that surround us. I understand that you have obligations and a life waiting for you in America. I make no demands and seek nothing from you. I wanted only for you to know that your kindness and love created something wonderful in the midst of so much destruction. Helena and I will make our way in this new world, and I will tell her of her father's courage when she is old enough to understand. If you wish to write to us, we can be reached at the address on the envelope. If not, please know that you are forever in our hearts. With eternal love, Sophia. Catherine read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking more with each reading. This couldn't be real. Her grandfather had been married to Eleanor for nearly 50 years until her death in 1997. According to family law, they had been childhood sweethearts who married shortly after his return from the war. And nowhere in the family history was there ever mention of a Polish woman named Sophia or a daughter named Helena. If this letter was authentic, Catherine had an aunt, possibly still living, whom she had never known existed, and her father, Robert, had a half-sister. Catherine carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it in her pocket. She spent another hour methodically going through the trunk, but found no other correspondence from Sophia Mazur. There were several letters bundled with faded ribbon, but all were from Eleanor, dated throughout 1944 and 45. The sun was setting by the time Catherine descended the attic stairs, her mind racing with questions. She needed to speak with her father, but she dreaded the conversation. If he knew about this, why had it been kept secret? And if he didn't know, how would this revelation affect him? Robert Aldridge returned home at 6:30, as he did every evening. At 63, he was a creature of habit, having worked as an accountant at the same firm for nearly 40 years. His wife, Margaret, had dinner waiting as Catherine set the table, her thoughts still preoccupied with the letter. Throughout dinner, Catherine remained distracted, answering her parents' questions with brief responses. Finally, as her mother cleared the plates, she turned to her father. "Dad, I found something in Grandpa's things I think you should see." Robert looked up from his coffee, his expression guarded. "What is it?" Catherine hesitated before withdrawing the envelope from her pocket. "It's a letter. It was hidden in Grandpa's helmet." Her father stared at the envelope, his face draining of color. "Where did you find this?" "In his military trunk in the attic. The helmet had a false liner, and this was tucked inside." Robert reached for the envelope with a trembling hand, but stopped short of taking it. "I think we should discuss this in private," he said, glancing toward the kitchen, where Margaret was loading the dishwasher. They moved to Robert's study, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Robert closed the door behind them and took a seat behind the desk, motioning for Catherine to sit opposite him. "Have you read it?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "Yes," Catherine admitted. "I'm sorry if that was wrong, but I had no idea what it was." Robert nodded slowly. "And what do you make of it?" "Is it true? Did Grandpa have a relationship with this woman, Sophia? Do I have an aunt in Poland?" Robert sighed deeply, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's complicated, Kathy. So much of that time was complicated." "So you knew about this?" Catherine leaned forward, surprised. "Not until I was 30 years old. Mom, your grandmother Eleanor told me after Grandpa had a heart attack in 1989. They thought he might not survive, and she wanted me to know the truth before he was gone." "What truth? What really happened?" Robert replaced his glasses and fixed his gaze on a framed family photo on his desk. Dad was part of the force that liberated southern Poland in 45. His unit was stationed near Krakow for several months during the occupation and reconstruction period. He met Sophia, who was working as a translator for the Allied forces. He paused, as if gathering strength for what came next. "They fell in love," Dad always said, in that intense way that happens during war, when everything feels urgent and temporary. He didn't know she was pregnant when his unit was reassigned. By the time he received her letter telling him about the baby, he was already engaged to Mom. Catherine tried to process this information. So Grandma knew about Sophia and the baby? Yes, eventually. Dad showed her the letter when it arrived. They had been childhood friends, and he felt he couldn't keep such a secret from her. Mom told me that they discussed it for days. Dad wanted to break off their engagement and find a way to bring Sophia and the baby to America, but it wasn't so simple. Why not if he loved Sophia? It was 1945, Kathy. The world was in chaos. Poland had fallen under Soviet influence, and getting people out wasn't easy. Dad was just a private first class with no special connections. And then there was the fact that Sophia was Jewish. Her entire family had been eliminated during the occupation. She had no documentation, no official existence in post-war records. The bureaucratic challenges were enormous. Catherine's mind was reeling. So what happened? Robert opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small leather-bound book. This is Dad's journal from 1945 through 47. He gave it to me after I learned about Sophia. It explains things better than I can. He handed the journal to Catherine, who took it carefully. Mum and Dad got married in December of 45, but he never stopped trying to find Sophia and Helena. He sent dozens of letters to the address in Krakow, but they all came back marked "Address Unknown," or simply vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. He contacted the Red Cross, military channels, even hired a private investigator in Poland in the 1950s. Nothing. Did he ever find them? Robert's expression darkened. In 1958, he received a letter from a woman who had been Sophia's neighbor. She wrote that Sophia and Helena had been relocated to a displaced persons camp in 46 and then had emigrated to Israel with other Jewish refugees. The neighbor had no forwarding address, no way for Dad to trace them further, and he just gave up. Catherine couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. No, Robert said firmly. He never gave up. Every few years he would try new avenues of inquiry, but this was before the internet, before global communications made the world small. Finding people behind the Iron Curtain was nearly impossible for an ordinary American. Does the rest of the family know about this? Aunt Susan? Uncle James? No. Only your grandmother, me, and now you. Dad asked that it be kept private, not because he was ashamed, but because he felt he had failed them. He couldn't save them, couldn't be a father to Helena. It was his greatest regret. Catherine sat back, trying to absorb everything she'd learned. So I might have an aunt and cousins, somewhere in the world, who don't even know we exist. Possibly. Helena would be in her mid-70s now if she's still alive. Catherine looked down at the journal in her hands, then back at her father. I want to find them, Dad. Robert's expression was a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. After all this time, it's been over 70 years, Kathy. Exactly. 70 years is too long for a family to be separated by war and circumstance. Grandpa never stopped trying. I think we owe it to him to try with the resources we have now that he didn't have then. Robert was silent for a long moment. You're right, he said finally. If they're out there, they should know about Thomas, about the man who never forgot them, who kept that letter with him through combat, through his entire life. Catherine felt a surge of determination. Where do we start? I have copies of all Dad's correspondence related to Sophia and Helena. It's not much, but it's something. And there's the private investigator's report from the 50s. It's all in a file in my office at work. Could you bring it home tomorrow? I will, Robert promised. But Kathy, prepare yourself for disappointment. This search has already spanned decades with no results. Catherine nodded, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. The internet, DNA databases, social media, tools her grandfather could never have imagined, were now at her fingertips. One more thing, Robert said, his voice heavy. Your mother doesn't know about any of this. Neither does anyone else in the family. I need you to keep this between us for now until we decide how, or if, to tell everyone. I understand, Catherine said, though part of her wondered at the continued secrecy. But eventually, if we find Helena or her children, the family will need to know. One step at a time, Robert cautioned. First, let's see if there's anyone to find. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She read her grandfather's journal by the soft glow of her bedside lamp, absorbing the words of a young soldier torn between duty, love, and circumstance. Thomas's writing was straightforward but emotional, detailing his meeting with Sophia while distributing food supplies in her neighborhood, their conversations in her limited English and his non-existent Polish, and how quickly their connection had deepened. He wrote of the guilt he felt upon returning home, seeing Eleanor waiting for him at the train station, knowing his heart was divided. He documented every attempt to find Sophia and Helena over the years, each failure cutting deeper than the last. The final entry, dated October 12, 1967, read simply, "Today Helena would turn 22. I wonder what kind of woman she has become. I wonder if she knows I have searched for her. I wonder if she hates me for not finding her. Eleanor suggests I let them go, that continuing to search only keeps the wound open. Perhaps she is right. But how does a father stop looking for his child?" Catherine wiped tears from her eyes as she closed the journal. Her grandfather, the quiet, kind man who had taught her to fish and always carried peppermints in his pockets, had carried this pain silently throughout his life. The next morning, Catherine called in sick to her job at the local library. By the time her father arrived home that evening with a thin manila folder, she had already mapped out a strategy for their search. "I've been researching all day," she told Robert, as they spread papers across the dining room table after her mother had gone to bed. "There are international databases for Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Israel has extensive records of immigrants from that period, and DNA testing might be our best option. If Helena or her children have ever submitted samples to any of the major genealogy sites, we could find a match." Robert looked impressed by her thoroughness. "I've kept this folder locked in my desk for years," and he said, opening it to reveal yellowed papers and a few black and white photographs. "This is everything Dad collected in his search." There were copies of letters to various agencies, all with disappointing responses. The report from the Polish investigator confirmed that Sophia and Helena had left for Israel, but provided no details of their destination. And most precious of all, a small photograph of a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes standing on a street corner in Krakow. Written on the back in Thomas's neat script, "Sophia, March 1945. "She was beautiful," Catherine said softly, studying the photograph. "Yes, she was," Robert agreed. "Dad said she had a remarkable spirit. Despite everything she'd endured during the occupation, she remained hopeful about the future." Catherine carefully set the photo aside and picked up a document written in Polish. "We'll need to get these translated. Dr. Levin at the university speaks Polish. I could ask him to help." "Perfect." Catherine made a note. "And I'll submit Grandpa's DNA sample to several genealogy databases." Robert looked confused. "We don't have his DNA." "Actually, we do," Catherine said. "I found his hairbrush in the bathroom cabinet when we were cleaning out his house last week. I kept it, thinking Mom might want it. There should be enough hair follicles for testing." Robert looked both impressed and slightly unsettled by his daughter's foresight. "You've really thought this through?" "I'm a librarian, Dad. Research is what I do." She hesitated before adding, "But there's something else we need to discuss. If we find Helena or her children, what then? Are you prepared to meet your half-sister, to explain why her father never came for her?" The question hung in the air between them. Finally, Robert spoke. "I don't know. I've known about her existence for over 30 years, but she's always been an abstraction, not a real person with a real life," he sighed. "But yes, if we find her, I want to meet her. I want her to know that her father never forgot her, never stopped trying to find her. The world tore them apart, not his choice." "Then we'll find her," Catherine said with a conviction she didn't entirely feel, "for Grandpa." In the weeks that followed, Catherine threw herself into the search with a dedication that surprised even her. She sent Thomas's hair samples to 3 different DNA testing companies, carefully completed applications to Holocaust survivor databases, and worked with Dr. Levin to translate the Polish documents. Most of the documents yielded little new information, but one letter from the neighbor in Krakow provided a vital clue. Sophia and Helena had traveled to Israel with a group from the Feldafing displaced persons camp in Germany. one of the largest camps for Jewish survivors after the war. Armed with this information, Catherine contacted the Israeli government office that maintained immigration records from that period. After several weeks and numerous emails, she received a response that made her heart race. They had located a record of a Sophia Mazer and her daughter Helena arriving in Haifa on June 12, 1948, aboard a ship called the Atzmaut. "Dad, they made it to Israel," Catherine announced triumphantly during their weekly meeting to discuss the search. "We have a date, a location. This is huge." Robert studied the printout of the immigration record, his expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. So they survived. They built a new life. He looked up at Catherine. "But this record is from 75 years ago. The trail goes cold after their arrival." "Not necessarily," Catherine countered. "Israel has excellent genealogical records. Now that we know they arrived there, we can trace forward, and the DNA tests should be returning results soon." Robert nodded, but Catherine could see the doubt in his eyes. "Dad, we'll find them. We've already come further than Grandpa ever did." 3 days later, Catherine received an email notification from one of the DNA testing companies. "Close family match found." Her hands trembled as she opened the email and clicked the link to the company's website. The match was identified as female Tel Aviv, Israel. The relationship prediction: first cousin once removed, 95% confidence. Catherine immediately called her father. "Dad, we have a DNA match. It's not Helena, but it could be her daughter, your niece." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Dad?" Catherine prompted. "Are you there?" "Yes," Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. "What do we do now?" "The site has a messaging system. I can send her a message explaining who we are and why we're searching." "Be careful what you say," Robert cautioned. "This will be shocking news for her too." Catherine spent hours drafting and redrafting the message. How did one introduce oneself to a cousin who had no idea their family existed? Finally, she settled on a straightforward approach. "Hello, my name is Catherine Aldridge. According to DNA testing, we appear to be closely related. I believe my grandfather, Thomas Aldridge, may have been the father of your mother or grandmother, Helena Mazer, born in Krakow, Poland in 1945. Thomas was an American soldier stationed in Poland after the war and formed a relationship with Sophia Mazer. He spent decades searching for them after they were separated. If this connection sounds familiar to you, I would very much like to communicate further. My family has only recently discovered this history, and we are eager to connect with relatives we never knew we had." She hit send and tried not to count the minutes as she waited for a response. To her surprise, a reply came less than 2 hours later. "This message has left me speechless. My name is Dina Levin. Helena Mazer was my mother. She passed away 5 years ago, never knowing what became of her American father. We had only my grandmother Sophia's stories about him and a single photograph. Sophia died in 1983. I have so many questions. Is Thomas still alive? How did you discover our existence?" Catherine's hands shook as she forwarded the message to her father, then immediately replied to Dina. "Thank you so much for responding. Thomas passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 96. While cleaning out his home, I discovered a letter from Sophia hidden in his military helmet. He had kept it all these years. My father, Thomas's son from his marriage in America, then revealed that Thomas had searched for Sophia and Helena for decades, but lost track of them after they moved to Israel. We have his journals, letters, and the original letter from Sophia. We would be so grateful to learn about Helena's life and to share with you what we know about Thomas. Would it be possible to arrange a video call?" Over the next few days, Catherine and Dina exchanged numerous messages. They arranged a video call for the following Sunday, when Robert would be available to join. Catherine learned that Dina was 45 years old, a physician in Tel Aviv, married with 2 teenage children. Helena had been a teacher and had married David Levin, an engineer, in 1967. They had 3 children, Dinah, and 2 sons, Aaron and Benjamin. When Sunday arrived, Catherine and Robert sat side by side at Catherine's dining room table, the laptop open before them. Robert was visibly nervous, repeatedly straightening his tie and checking his hair. "Dad, relax," Catherine said gently. "They're family." "Family we've never met," Robert replied. "Family that might resent us for having Thomas when they didn't." Before Catherine could respond, the video call connected, and a woman with dark curly hair and familiar eyes appeared on screen. Thomas's eyes, Catherine realized with a start. Dina had her grandfather's eyes. "Hello," Dina said, her English accented but clear. "It's so strange to see you, like meeting characters from a story I've heard all my life but never quite believed." Robert seemed unable to speak, so Catherine took the lead. "Thank you for agreeing to talk with us, Dina. This is my father, Robert, Thomas's son." "You look like him," Dina said, studying Robert's face. "My mother had his photograph. Sophia kept it wrapped in silk until the day she died." Robert found his voice at last. "I can't tell you how surreal this feels. I've known about Helena since I was 30, but my father believed both of you were lost to history." "Not lost," Dina corrected gently. "Just on a different path. My grandmother Sophia was a remarkable woman. She rebuilt her life from nothing twice over, first after losing her entire family in the war, then again as an immigrant in a new country with a young child." "We'd love to hear about her life," Catherine said, "and about your mother. Thomas never stopped looking for them. He kept Sophia's letter with him throughout the war, hidden in his helmet." Dina's eyes widened. "The helmet? My mother used to say that her father would come for them wearing his American helmet. Even as a child, she would watch for a man in a helmet." She shook her head, smiling sadly. "Sophia told her it was just a story, eventually. They had to move forward with their lives." "Did Helena ever try to find Thomas?" Robert asked hesitantly. "Many times," Dina confirmed, "especially after Israel established better relations with the West, but she had so little to go on. Just a name, Thomas Aldridge, and that he was from somewhere in Connecticut. She wrote to military records offices, but received no helpful responses. In the 1990s, when the internet became available, she searched online, but by then she was elderly, and her English was limited. They were both searching," Catherine said softly, "but never finding each other." "The tragic irony," Dina agreed, "but perhaps not entirely tragic. Both built good lives. Both had families who loved them, and now, at last, those families have found each other." The conversation flowed more easily after that. Dina showed them photographs of Helena throughout her life, as a young woman at her wedding, as a mother with her children, as a grandmother surrounded by grandchildren. She spoke of Sophia's strength, how she had worked as a translator for new immigrants in Israel while raising Helena alone. Robert, in turn, shared stories of Thomas's life in America, his 48-year marriage to Eleanor, his career as a high school history teacher. He showed Dina the journal and the investigator's report, tangible evidence of Thomas's unceasing search for his lost family. "There's something else," Catherine said as the call neared its end. She held up the helmet. "This belonged to Thomas. The letter was hidden inside it throughout his time in combat. We thought you might want to have it." Dina's eyes filled with tears. "My mother would have treasured it," she said. "I would be honored to have it for my children, to help them understand their history." "We'll send it right away," Robert promised, along with copies of Thomas's journal and photographs. "And perhaps," Dina suggested hesitantly, "you might visit us in Israel, or we could come to America. My children should meet their American family." "We would love that," Catherine said immediately, looking to her father for confirmation. Robert nodded, blinking back tears. "Yes, it's time our families were united." As they said their goodbyes, with promises to speak again soon, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. Her grandfather's story hadn't ended with his death 3 weeks ago. In some ways, it was just beginning. The letter in the helmet, carried through combat, preserved for decades, had finally fulfilled its purpose, connecting two branches of a family separated by war, geography, and time. 3 months later, Catherine stood in the arrivals hall at Bradley International Airport, watching as passengers streamed through the gates. Beside her, Robert shifted nervously from foot to foot, while her mother, Margaret, arranged and rearranged the welcome sign they had made. The rest of the American Aldridge family, Aunt Susan, Uncle James, and various cousins stood in a cluster nearby. After much discussion, Robert had decided to share the full story with the entire family. There had been shock, questions, even some anger that such a significant family history had been kept secret for so long. But ultimately there had been acceptance and excitement about meeting their Israeli relatives. "There they are," Catherine said suddenly, spotting Dina's familiar face in the crowd. She was accompanied by a tall man, her husband Eli, and two teenagers who looked around with undisguised curiosity. As the two families moved toward each other, Catherine felt a momentary awkwardness. How did one greet relatives who were simultaneously strangers and family? But Dina broke through the uncertainty, embracing first Catherine, then Robert, with tears in her eyes. "Welcome to America," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing us home," Dina replied. They spent the next 2 weeks introducing the Levins to New England, the fall foliage just beginning to turn, the colonial architecture of Millfield, the family home where Thomas had lived for 60 years. They visited Thomas's grave, where Dina placed stones in the Jewish tradition and recited a prayer in Hebrew. On their final evening together, Catherine presented Dina with a leather-bound album she had created. Inside were photographs of Thomas throughout his life, copies of his wartime letters, and the original letter from Sophia that had started their journey. "For your family," Catherine said, "so they will know both sides of their history." Dina accepted the album with reverence. "And I have something for you," she said, handing Catherine a small package wrapped in blue paper. Inside was a delicate silver Star of David on a chain. "This belonged to my grandmother Sophia," Dina explained. "She wore it hidden beneath her clothes during the occupation when being identified as Jewish meant death. After the war, she wore it openly as a symbol of survival. My mother inherited it, and now I'd like you to have it, to remember the Jewish heritage that is also part of your story." Catherine was speechless, tears filling her eyes as she held the necklace. Robert stepped forward, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Thank you," he said to Dina, "for sharing your family with us, for allowing us to be part of your story." "Our story," Dina corrected gently. "One story, with many chapters, some joyful, some painful, but all part of who we are together." As the two families gathered for a final dinner, Catherine looked around the table at these people who had been strangers just months ago. The teenagers were laughing together, comparing music and movies across continents. The adults were discussing plans for the American family to visit Israel the following summer. The awkwardness had melted away, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of family. Catherine touched the Star of David, now hanging around her neck, and thought of the helmet that had traveled to Israel, carrying with it the physical embodiment of her grandfather's devotion. She thought of the letter that had waited patiently for 75 years to deliver its message, and she thought of two people, Thomas and Sophia, whose brief connection across the chaos of war had created ripples that would continue long after they were gone. 1 year later, Catherine stood on a hill overlooking Jerusalem, the ancient city spread out before her in the golden afternoon light. The Aldridge and Levin families had gathered in Israel to commemorate the anniversary of their reunion and to fulfill a promise. In her hands, Catherine held a small box containing equal portions of soil, half from Thomas's grave in Connecticut, half from Sophia's grave in Tel Aviv. At her side stood Dina, holding Thomas's helmet, now a treasured family heirloom. "They never had a chance to stand together in life," Catherine said, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "But we can unite them now, in this place, through their families, and through the earth that holds them." Together, she and Dina mixed the soils and scattered them across the hillside, watching as the wind carried the particles across the landscape. American and Israeli earth, intermingling just as their families had. The helmet had completed its journey. The letter had fulfilled its purpose. And a family, once divided by war and circumstance, stood united at last. In the distance, the sun began to set over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. Catherine thought of her grandfather, who had carried both his love and his regret with quiet dignity throughout his long life. She wondered if he and Sophia could somehow see their families united at last, their love having created not just Helena, but this moment of healing across generations. As the group made their way back down the hill toward the waiting cars, Catherine's father walked beside her. "Your grandfather would be proud," Robert said quietly. "You found them when no one else could." "We found each other," Catherine corrected. "The letter in the helmet was just waiting for the right moment to be discovered." "Some secrets," Robert said thoughtfully, "aren't meant to remain hidden forever, just long enough for the world to be ready for them." Catherine nodded, understanding now why her grandfather had kept Sophia's letter hidden yet accessible. It wasn't shame that had guided his secrecy, but patience. A patience born of the knowledge that some stories can only be fully told when all their threads have been gathered together. The helmet had protected more than just Thomas during the war. It had protected a truth that would ultimately bring healing rather than harm, connection rather than division, love rather than loss. And in doing so, it had transformed a family's understanding of itself, revealing that their history was richer and more complex than they had ever imagined. As their rental cars wound through the streets of Jerusalem toward the hotel where both families were staying, Catherine reflected on how a single object, a standard-issue M1 helmet, had become the unlikely catalyst for this reunion. Military equipment designed for protection in combat had decades later protected and preserved a love story that transcended the very conflict in which it was forged. That evening, as both families gathered for dinner, Dina's son Daniel, 16 years old and passionate about filmmaking, presented a video he had created. He had interviewed members of both families, intercut with photographs of Thomas, Sophia, and Helena throughout the years, creating a visual timeline of their separated yet connected lives. "I call it the helmet's journey, Arin," he announced proudly as the video began to play. The final scene showed the helmet sitting on a simple wooden shelf in Dina's home in Tel Aviv, sunlight streaming through a window to illuminate it. Beneath it lay Sophia's letter, now preserved in a glass frame, and around it, photographs of both families, American and Israeli, past and present, creating a constellation of connections that spanned continents and generations. As the video ended, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Robert raised his glass in a toast. "To Thomas and Sophia," he said, "whose love created not just Helena but all of us together, here in this moment." To Thomas and Sophia, the families echoed. Later that night, as Catherine sat on the balcony of her hotel room looking out at the lights of Jerusalem, she thought about how history is written not just in textbooks and official records, but in personal artifacts, helmets and letters, photographs and journals, how individual lives intersect with great historical events in ways both profound and intimate, how war divides but love connects. Her grandfather had been one private first class among millions of soldiers. Sophia had been one survivor among countless displaced people. Their brief connection might have been forgotten entirely, reduced to a statistical footnote in the massive population movements of post-war Europe. But the helmet had preserved more than just a letter. It had preserved the possibility of completion, of answers, of reunion. It had carried their story safely through time until the moment was right for it to be discovered. And in doing so, it had changed not just Catherine's understanding of her family's past, but its present and future as well. The Aldrich family was now inextricably linked with the Levin family, their holidays marked by transatlantic calls, their family photos including faces that would have been strangers just 2 years ago. All because of a helmet and the precious cargo it had carried through decades of silence. 6 months later, Catherine stood in the attic of her parents' home once again. The space was transformed now, no longer a repository of forgotten belongings, but a carefully organized archive of family history. The military trunk remained, but its contents had been catalogued, preserved, and in some cases, shared with the Israeli branch of the family. She was preparing materials for an exhibit at the Millfield Historical Society, letters from war, personal stories of World War II. Thomas and Sophia's story would be featured prominently, with permission from both families, as an example of how global conflict affected individual lives for generations. The helmet itself remained with Dina in Israel, but Catherine had commissioned a replica for the exhibit, along with enlarged photographs of both Thomas and Sophia in their youth. Visitors would be able to read translated excerpts from Sophia's letter and from Thomas's journal. witnessing the personal dimensions of a war often discussed only in terms of battles, dates, and casualty figures. As she worked, Catherine reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since finding the letter. She had traveled to Israel twice now and was planning a third trip to attend the wedding of Dinah's daughter, Sarah. She was learning Hebrew, slowly but steadily, wanting to connect more deeply with her newfound family. And she had begun writing a book about the search, wanting to document the process for future generations. Most significantly, she had developed a close relationship with Dinah, their weekly video calls becoming a cherished routine. Despite growing up in completely different cultures, they had discovered remarkable similarities in their personalities, their sense of humor, their approach to life's challenges. Thomas's granddaughters, as they called themselves, recognizing the invisible threads of inheritance that connected them across distance. Catherine's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Dinah. "Did you receive the package?" Dinah asked after they had exchanged greetings. "Just this morning," Catherine confirmed. "It's perfect for the exhibit." "Thank you." "Sarah found more of my grandmother's papers," Dinah continued. "Letters she wrote to Thomas but never sent. They're in Polish, but I'm having them translated for you." "That's incredible," Catherine said, emotion welling in her throat. "It's like their conversation is continuing even now." "That's exactly what I thought," Dinah agreed. "Their story wasn't finished, just paused for a very long time." After they hung up, Catherine returned to her cataloguing, but her mind remained on Dinah's words. A story paused, not finished. It seemed an apt description, not just for Thomas and Sophia's relationship, but for the connection between their families as well, a connection interrupted by circumstance, by geography, by the limitations of technology and communication in a pre-digital age, but never truly broken. The helmet had kept that connection safe, preserved within its curved steel shell like a seed, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And grow it had, into something neither Thomas nor Sophia could have imagined. Two families, an ocean apart, finding their way back to each other across decades of separation. As Catherine prepared the final items for the exhibit, she came across a photograph she had nearly forgotten. It showed Thomas in his later years, sitting on the porch of the family home in Millfield. He was looking away from the camera, his expression pensive, almost wistful. Catherine had taken the photo herself during a visit home from college, capturing her grandfather in an unguarded moment. She studied it now with new understanding. What had he been thinking about in that moment? Was he remembering Sophia, wondering about Helena, carrying the weight of their absence even as he sat surrounded by his American family? Had there been moments when he looked at Robert, at Susan and James, at his grandchildren, and thought of the other family he had never known? These questions would remain unanswered, but the photograph would join the others in the exhibit, a visual representation of the complexity of a single human life, of how one person could contain multiple stories, multiple loves, multiple regrets, all authentic, all true. In the end, Catherine reflected, that was perhaps the most powerful lesson of the helmet and its hidden letter. Human lives resist simplification. They overflow with contradictions, with paths taken and not taken, with connections made and lost, and sometimes remarkably rediscovered. Thomas had been both the devoted husband to Eleanor and the man who never forgot Sophia. He had been both Robert's loving father and Helena's absent one. He had been both the young soldier caught in the chaos of war and the elderly man who kept a letter hidden in his helmet for over 70 years, preserving the evidence of a love that circumstances had denied, but never erased. The exhibit opened on a cool October evening, drawing a larger crowd than the Millfield Historical Society had anticipated. Local veterans came to see the collection of wartime correspondence. History teachers brought students to learn about the personal dimensions of global conflict, and both the American and Israeli branches of the Aldridge-Levin family gathered to witness their story, shared with the community. Catherine stood beside the display featuring Thomas's helmet replica and the enlarged photographs of Thomas and Sophia in their youth. Nearby, Dinah explained the story to a group of fascinated high school students, her English now peppered with distinctive New England phrases she had picked up from her American relatives. The most remarkable thing, Catherine overheard Dinah telling the students, is that both my mother and Catherine's father grew up with incomplete stories about their parents. They each had one present parent and one absent one. But those absent parents, Thomas for my mother, Sophia for Robert, shaped their lives nonetheless, like shadows they couldn't quite see but always sensed were there. Catherine smiled, thinking how perfectly Dina had captured it. The absent parent, the road not taken, the life not lived, had influenced both families in ways they were only now beginning to understand. A local reporter approached Catherine, notebook in hand. "What do you hope people take away from this exhibit?" she asked. Catherine considered the question carefully. "I hope they understand that history isn't just about significant dates and famous people. It's about millions of individual lives intersecting with world events in ways both large and small. Every artifact in this exhibit, every letter, photograph, diary entry, represents a real person trying to navigate an extraordinary time." She gestured toward the helmet. "This standard-issue piece of equipment protected my grandfather during combat, but it also protected something equally precious, a connection that war and circumstances tried to sever, but couldn't destroy completely. In its own way, that's a kind of victory over the forces that divide us." Later that evening, as the families gathered for dinner at Robert and Margaret's home, Catherine watched as her cousins and Dinah's children helped set the table together, their conversation flowing easily despite their different accents and cultural references. Robert and Dina's husband, Eli, were deep in discussion about potentially doing business together, while Margaret and Dina exchanged recipes. These ordinary moments of family life seemed almost miraculous when Catherine considered the improbability of their connection, how easily it might never have happened at all. If she hadn't volunteered to clean out her grandfather's attic, if Thomas hadn't preserved Sophia's letter, if Dina hadn't submitted her DNA to the same database Catherine had chosen. So many chance factors had aligned to bring them to this moment. Or perhaps, Catherine thought, it wasn't chance at all, but persistence. The persistence of Thomas in never completely abandoning his search, the persistence of Helena in keeping her father's memory alive through stories told to her children, the persistence of love and connection across time and distance. As they gathered around the table, Robert raised his glass. "I've been thinking about what to say tonight," he began, "how to express what this past year has meant to our family. And I keep coming back to something my father wrote in his journal after he returned from the war. Some journeys continue long after we think they've ended." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on Dinah. "My father's journey to find Helena and Sophia seemed to end in disappointment. But it continued through Catherine, through DNA and internet searches, through technologies he could never have imagined. And now we sit here together. Proof that some connections are too strong to be broken, even by war, even by decades of separation." "To journeys that continue," Dina added, raising her glass. "To journeys that continue," the families echoed. After dinner, as the evening wound down, Catherine found herself alone in the living room with Dina. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of their families chatting in the kitchen. "Do you think they know?" Dina asked suddenly. "Who?" "Thomas and Sophia. Do you think they know their families found each other?" Catherine considered the question. "I'm not sure about the mechanics of the afterlife," she said thoughtfully, "but I like to think they do, that they've witnessed everything that's happened since I found that letter." Dinah nodded. "In Jewish tradition, we believe that righteous souls continue to involve themselves in the lives of their descendants, to guide and protect them. Perhaps they've been guiding us all along." The thought was comforting. Catherine imagined Thomas and Sophia watching over them, witnessing the healing of the rift that war had created between their families. "What will you do with the helmet eventually?" Catherine asked. "It's such an important artifact now." "I've been thinking about that," Dina replied. "I believe it should continue its journey. Perhaps to a museum where its story can educate others about the personal costs of war and the endurance of human connection. Or perhaps it should alternate between our families, spending time in America, then in Israel, connecting us physically the way its story has connected us emotionally." "I like that idea," Catherine said. "The helmet continuing its journey, just as our family's story continues." As the evening came to a close and the families prepared to part ways, the Israeli relatives returning to their hotel, the Americans to their respective homes, Catherine found herself standing once more before the replica helmet in the hallway. In the dim light, it seemed almost identical to the original that had traveled so far and preserved so much. She thought of all the helmets like it, worn by countless soldiers in countless conflicts. How many of them had carried hidden treasures, letters, photographs, good luck charms? How many untold stories remained concealed within the artifacts of war, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The helmet had completed its most important mission not during combat, but 75 years later, when its secret contents had finally found their way to those who needed them most. It had protected not just a soldier, but a truth. Not just a letter, but a legacy. And that, Catherine reflected, was perhaps the most powerful protection of all, the preservation of human connection across time, distance, and circumstance. The assurance that even in the midst of history's darkest chapters, love creates threads that cannot be permanently broken, only temporarily obscured until the moment they are rediscovered, revealing patterns of connection more intricate and beautiful than anyone could have imagined. As the two families said their goodbyes, promising to speak soon, to visit often, to never again lose touch, Catherine knew that the helmet's journey, and theirs, would continue, their shared story unfolding in ways that Thomas and Sophia could never have foreseen, but would surely have celebrated. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.